Very, very happy, very excited to have the lecturer here tonight. I'm not going to introduce him. His name is Roger Sherman. He's a visiting critic this semester. He's an old friend, and he's a brilliant guy, and he's going to give a great talk. And all of you are very lucky to be here tonight. So it'll be a terrific talk. I'm going to introduce very briefly Lindsay Harkema, who's going to come up and give the introduction. But before I do so, as important as Ryder's arrival today is, we also, our scarves came today, and I'm going to present the lecturer one. Wow. Yeah. Okay, now it's for you. That's for you. Wow.
So welcome everybody. It's an honor to introduce Roger Sherman, visiting critic this semester and senior project director of urban strategy at Gensler Los Angeles, and founder of Roger Sherman Architecture and Urban Design. He also is the co-director of cityLAB from 2006 to 2015, which is an urban design think tank at UCLA, where he's also a professor. Roger's highly acclaimed, award-winning projects include a 2,200-acre master plan for Fresh Kills landfill in Staten Island, which was conceived to accommodate ecological, political, and economic evolution over time. An iconic repurposing of an LA parking structure, enabling new modes of urban connectivity and activation, and establishing a new destination within the downtown area of Los Angeles. And a rethinking of the big box retail store as a new development model and venue for collective urban life, encompassing ecological, recreational, and commercial amenities proposed for sites at the urban edge. Roger's work has been exhibited at the 2009, 2010, 2016 Rotterdam and Venice Biennale, and featured in Newsweek, Fast Company, CNN, and the History Channel. At Gensler, Sherman leads a new infrastructure and urban development plan for northern Haiti, a digitally driven signage and public space installation for the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood, and Hypo Park, a high-density model of public recreational space for underserved communities in LA. Sherman graduated with distinction from the Harvard GSD and has taught and lectured widely. He's the author of several books, including LA Under the Influence, The Hidden Logic of Urban Property, R.E. American Dream, and most recently, Forward Urbanism with Dana Cuff. Roger's broad spectrum of work is inspirational in its commitment to creating projects that simultaneously operate at many scales and introduce innovative spatial, performative, and programmatic solutions that are artful, responsible, socially relevant, scientifically sound, and technologically innovative. So please welcome me in welcoming Roger Sherman.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that great, very nice introduction, and Michael for the scarf. I feel like I should be wearing it through the lecture. But I have to give another shameless plug for this book, which is actually the reason why is the root of the lecture I'm giving you tonight, which was something that was published at Syracuse 4 years ago, edited by Julia Zerniak, called Formerly Urban. There were a bunch of us, some of my most respected colleagues, who got together here in a small group and really talked about the future of Rust Belt cities. Of course, I don't really come from a Rust Belt city, but I used it as an opportunity to talk about some things in Los Angeles, a lot of which I'm going to be talking about tonight. And because at that time, Julia only gave me 15 minutes, but I had prepared something that was about an hour long, I'm taking the opportunity to actually be able to give it in its proper length, and hopefully won't be longer than that. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to be back at Syracuse with many friends, both from LA present and LA past, Georgina and Michael as well included. So I think what I'd like to do is just do a little bit of a mixture of, if you'll pardon me, reading a little bit from this because I want to make sure to kind of get the kind of thesis out really clearly, and then I'll, as we get into each of the projects that I'm going to show, I think there are about 3 or 4 of them, I'll just kind of extemporize a little bit more in just describing what they're about. Like a lot of my work, my interests in architecture really have to do with observations that I make about what's going on in the city, things that are happening that I feel are somewhat out of sync with where we are as a design profession, and I kind of use those problems as a way of kind of pulling or exerting a gravitational pull upon my own practice to elicit solutions to problems that are not yet recognized but are there in plain sight. So in a weird way, it's a kind of refutation of the idea of traditional avant-garde thinking by saying that in a way the world is actually further out in front than we are, and that actually it can be a form of radicalizing what we do and avoiding a kind of inert conservatism that we can oftentimes be prone to develop as architects. So this, what I'm going to talk about today, which is what I call battery power, recharging architecture's urban effects, was in response to one of these kinds of instincts. Those who have at any point over the past 20 or so years followed the discourse on the design of the contemporary city cannot help but be led to the conclusion that the architect's last best hope to shape an increasingly unruly and uncontrollable metropolitan condition is through its networks of infrastructure. The preponderance of empirical evidence, however, gives precisely the opposite impression, that infrastructure has in fact been and continues to be the prime culprit at the root of a now century-long marginalization of architecture's role in shaping urban experience. Technocratically conceived and managed, these networks are at ground level indifferent to the buildings they serve. Recent sea changes in the politics and economics of cities, however, suggest that a reconfiguration of the manner in which public services are provided is underway, offering an unprecedented opportunity for architects to challenge infrastructure's conventional primacy upon performance, optimization, maintenance, and safety to the exclusion of collateral visual and spatial benefits to the city that it supports. Excuse me. Even as it has never been more dependable, this is a picture of a housing development that went dry as a result of the 2008 recession out in Riverside County. And it was actually that moment that brought me to a lot of these kinds of conclusions as to this failed model that I'm discussing. Even as it has never been more dependable and efficient in collecting and distributing resources, waste, and people, infrastructure has progressively become spatially disconnected from the public it serves. It is difficult to fathom that just a century ago, long before the advent of best management practices, what in my new role is referred to through the acronym BMP, and so-called smart cities, the experience of urban space was shaped by buildings. Spaces of movement directly and visibly engaged the private properties that fronted upon them, as you see here in the kind of iconic Western town in which the sidewalk came with the building. Architecture was invested with and negotiated between a dual agency corresponding to, on the one hand, the agenda of its sponsors, and on the other, an instrumental role in the life of the city in which it served as a prop. Colin Rowe used the term set piece, a kind of a theatrical language, as a means of arguing for the public status of even a private structure on the basis of its, not of its objecthood, a critique of modernism's urban legacy, but as a setting or backdrop capable of attracting urban life. This model of urban building ended, however, in the early 20th century with the rise of planning as a discipline distinct from architecture. With more efficient delivery systems for water, power, and transportation, requiring a skill set in management and logistics, over that of the orchestration of public appearance, the relationship between the two fields became progressively more detached. Today, the design of the flows of water, waste, power, vehicles, etc. produces de facto a genus of public space that is neither urban nor public. For architects, it has also preempted a false choice between designing on the one hand a demure background building, so-called background building, and on the other, pursuing a more solipsistic rhetorical agenda, the icon object building more interested in autonomous expression than collective engagement. Since the Reagan era, however, the now century-old systems model of infrastructure has proven increasingly difficult to implement. Onerous processes of appropriations, approvals, bidding, and oversight have made the public sector incapable of delivering projects as timely and cost-effectively as its private counterparts. So here you see the big plan, the $95 billion plan to build a high-speed rail in California. That is likely certainly not to be built in its entirety, without which it makes no sense. But instead, because with the money that's actually available and fearing that the public will be all over them, the agency has determined to basically build a segment of rail that goes from a rural city to a rural city, so that it can make all of its mistakes in the relative obscurity of rural countryside before it actually enters into the bigger areas that are more urbanized. And in Boston, each of these colors indicates the separate consulting or construction contracts that were needed to be doled out to different companies to ensure that this was an even-handed competitive bidding process, which made for a hornet's nest of construction coordination, which resulted in huge cost overruns. In response, government overseers have resorted to incremental, piecemeal, pay-as-you-go methods of execution, resulting in a degraded version of infrastructure that resembles deferred maintenance more than the larger-scale public initiatives that characterized its WPA-era heyday, such as Grand Central Station, which I showed you earlier. Not simply attributable to the 2008 recession and mounting government deficits, such a development is both a cause and a symptom of an increasingly distrustful and self-interested public, reluctant to fund projects of larger collective benefit. Public enthusiasm for and wonderment at the effort behind the delivery of the services it once provided is today accorded to the effortless instantaneousness of digital connectivity. Whether in surrender to or in ignorance of this fact, planners have adopted a decidedly lowbrow approach to infrastructure's appearance, lest it become a symbol of government waste. This is another example. I have numerous ones of the so-called great park that now is parodied as the not-so-great park, which ironically went from the design of a very good landscape architect, Ken Smith, of an old, for a master plan for a park for Orange County on an old Marine base, to the firm that I currently am working at, Gensler, which is becoming in charge of basically a much more reduced project that's being financed through the cannibalization of the same land by a single-family housing development. So this is all that in effect he will have had to show for it, and the fact that it's a big orange balloon adds even more poignancy to the symptom. This is another example in Tennessee. And this idea of one piece at a time, this is the Johnny Cash album cover where his crew, who were all working at the Cadillac plant on their last day of work, just carried out a piece of a car that they were making and eventually reassembled it over time, is more or less a good metaphor for what has become of our approach to infrastructure. However, I'm giving this talk not as something as a means of sort of trying to be overly pessimistic. Actually, for me, it provides a kind of a silver lining. Because as a result of this, public officials have begun exploring how risk can be better managed by delegating to the more disciplined private sector the responsibility of designing and constructing public facilities as part and parcel of their own developments, limiting government involvement to compliance and oversight. Public participation is not eliminated, but instead strategically leveraged in the form of subsidies, tax breaks, and entitlements. As a carrot aimed at rewarding or incentivizing private development initiatives willing to assume the risk, cost, and liability of building public amenities into their pro formas. Rather than being provided as part of a larger connective network, these projects, which could be termed battery-powered, are by definition circumstantial and opportunistic. Localized in scale and reach by contrast to the network model, their ambition is driven by supply-side design approaches that value profitability over self-sufficiency and are oriented around catchment rather than service area or watershed. For architects, this newfound legal and financial interdependency between government and private development provides an unparalleled opportunity to reclaim its agency and instrumentality in city making, relocates the provision and design of collective amenities to the scale and format of the individual building and its influences and effects upon the spaces adjacent to it. So I'm going to give you a few examples just to kind of show what I'm talking about. Many of you may actually know about this. They're probably the most, this is a Chris Burden installation, which is sitting out in front of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. These are probably the most famous streetlights that you ever have paid attention to, as opposed to ones that you never pay attention to, because they're actually used in a normal setting. And yet at the same time, they're actually the same streetlights. The streetlights themselves were not designed by Burden. They were simply collected and reassembled as a way of sort of talking about how the systems model of using lights as part of a network are reassembled into something which is beginning to approach something of an axiomatic object or element which has identity. And to add further poignancy to this, sitting discreetly behind it is a design by the famous architect Renzo Piano that was felt to be altogether insufficient by both the public and by the museum directors as a means of engaging the city itself due to its mute status within the city, because it was designed really from the inside out, just as a kind of box for the display of art. And so instead, art, and this is a kind of a separate discussion, art is used as a means of resuscitating the insufficiency of architects to actually address the public sector through the idea of through these kinds of problems that I'm eliminating. What can I say? This sort of speaks for itself, right? We didn't build the bridge, McDonald's built it, right? But it's clear that it was an advantage for McDonald's to do it. There's no better advertising opportunity. Many of you probably out in the Midwest know that Stuckey's was doing this for quite some time, but I think McDonald's is more artful, and so on. In many ways, the strategy behind the way that these projects have to work in that sense is that the battery-powered model operates as a kind of a Trojan horse in which infrastructure is simply being used as the means or conceit or pretext in order to deliver public space, rather than just following a purely performative model. Freed to assume a more entrepreneurial approach to providing public amenities, the privatization of infrastructure leverages the imperative of satisfying needs to create places of desire, destinations. This I'm showing is the site plan for the Place Vendôme in Paris. If any of you know it, you may not recognize it right here because it's before the rest of Paris was filled in, but they built the space with a kind of Potemkin village of facades around it to increase the value of the land that was actually outside it. And so it had adopted a kind of Trojan horse strategy, which was really that it was a real estate development that sought to create its value by the pretense of creating something that was of infrastructural value. This, for the property owner and his or her architect, this offers the opportunity to enhance their political agency by using contents and appearance as a double-jointed proposition, as Trojan horse or as bait and hook, eschewing the fix some dynamic of NIMBYism in favor of a calculated strategy of trade-offs. Public benefits are built in as a means of sweetening the collective pot to elicit stakeholder or market interest. So this is how it eventually got developed out with all of the housing around it here that you see. And I think what really becomes interesting over time is when you get these kinds of things happening. I dare any infrastructural technocrat to imagine how a piece of infrastructure could actually have enough strong identity to generate its own jewelry. But I think that ought to be the inspiration that, in a way, the object icon is not the only means of achieving notions of identity in the city. And with this, these questions of identity become kind of pulled into the discussion because those are much more complex when we start to talk, and this is what my own studio here at Syracuse is dealing with, whether or not Coca-Cola and Islamicism can coexist. Indeed, they are for expeditious purposes, or whether the Bridge of Sighs and a vodka can also somehow find ways of assuming different identities as well. This is, again, it's kind of the Trojan horse aspect, the kind of paradoxical nature of the city and the question of identity. So I showed this a little bit at the lottery, I think, but you know, we tracked in an earlier exercise that I worked through for the History Channel with Dana Cuff and with Bob Summel, an idea that culture has really splintered into many different subfactions, much in the same way that we've gone from four network channels on television in the 60s and 70s to literally thousands of cable channels today to address the various tastes of people. Yet infrastructure itself still works according to a kind of universalist model of what is best and what is optimal for all people, when in fact we use the city in different kinds of ways. So my question really is to think about whether we could explore the provision of collective benefit, of collective spaces and collective services in as varied a way as we have for many years as architects in object making. These are all of the different enclaves that all have to some extent or other been starting to provide their own infrastructural models according to the battery-powered paradigm that I'm discussing today. They use different mediums and methods in each case, but they all begin to do that. Why? It's because the universalist model of infrastructure is no longer sufficient to support all of these different subcultures and communities equally well. There are disadvantaged groups. As we know, there's a lot of inequity and inequality. And in many cases, they take up the slack through the private sector to begin to provide those. This is in my book, Under the LA Under the Influence. This is a situation of an agent for a number of comedians like Tim Allen and Drew Carey, who actually created a privately made public space on a cul-de-sac in Encino by negotiating a deal with his neighbor to use both of their side yards, which were dedicated to driveways, to create a wiffle ball court, which now the neighborhood and the surrounding community use, but they also are engaging the hillside that I'm standing on, which is surrounding a reservoir, as the bleachers looking in on the field itself. So this is actually public land that has been given an easement, has allowed an easement for his private use. So I would challenge anyone to say that this is not in many ways a form of infrastructure that's being provided, albeit not to the entire population of Los Angeles, but to a more qualified group of people who are through friends and family, but aren't necessarily neighbors. They're people that he knows through his business contacts and through various other friends who come from throughout Los Angeles to get together on every Sunday to smoke weed, eat a lot of food, and play baseball. And at the same time as there are many other spaces that are have been officially sponsored by the City of LA that remain vacant after millions of dollars have been spent on them. We see the same phenomenon on Lombard Street. I think it's very interesting that everybody knows this street. and yet it was the only street in San Francisco that was privately developed, whereas we would have a very hard time recognizing or knowing any of the other blocks or streets of San Francisco as well that were designed through another way. In this particular case, by contrast to traditional infrastructure's planarily logic of optimization, how best something can perform, the battery-powered model is charged by the uncanny possibilities of reorchestration, how else things can work, or how else things might work. This makes particular sense in an era of unprecedented digital connectivity, characterized by a sharing economy that prizes access over ownership. This is a lot of people are appalled, especially when I go to talk to people who are urban designers, appalled that I show this example of the McDonald's play space, but like it or not, in many communities of the city, this is the only recreational space that lies within walking distance of where people's households are. So they may be still trying to sell hamburgers, and there may be something greatly disturbing and insidious about that. But the fact of the matter is that as a phenomenon, a little bit like Pokemon Go, it's a recognition of a paradigm shift and a space that has opened up for architects to be able to step in and realize that, in fact, maybe not unlike the Medici did in many, many hundreds of years ago, there's a place in which the line between public and private is beginning to gray, and there are potentially interesting opportunities to take advantage of in the best possible way. A resultant explosion of new forms of identity holds unprecedented potential for the design of new formats of propinquity, ones more unique than the ubiquitous work, live, and play nomenclature, which has become the meme of most current development. Predicated upon a fundamental reconsideration of the public as neither assumed nor uniform, the battery-powered approach sees the city as comprised of a vast and complex array of distinct yet overlapping subcultures, the same of which our culture at large is now constituted. Okay. So what I'd like to do is show you 4 projects and to just sort of serve as illustrations of this. The first one I'm going to show you is one that we did in 2009. We're commissioned by Target Corporation in Minneapolis. We were commissioned, interestingly enough, not by the architecture nor the real estate development division, but actually by the marketing division of Target, which is where all the innovation has come. The other thing that's really important to understand about Target is that they, unlike all other big box retailers, Target owns its properties. It doesn't lease them. So it has a larger degree of investment in being a kind of, let's call it a citizen, or I would say just a degree of commitment to the place that its retail stores are located. Now, in this case, I think what we did was a kind of a very brief history of commercial development, which went from simple display where you actually saw the ducks in the window of the store to seeing to Venturi's decorated shed that you see here in various forms, and the duck itself, the Long Island duckling, which will make another reappearance in another project in a different form, to something that we called our strategy Duck and Cover, where something was actually both a sign and actually a kind of a habitable place. We were interested in this kind of phenomenon of things in which identity became kind of synonymous with the characteristic of the city. But we were also interested in basically not trying to pretend like a wolf in sheep's clothing, that a single large building was actually made up like a Ponderosa Steakhouse, parading as a kind of urban streetscape. That clearly was a kind of falsification. That ultimately to us struck us as being more of a defensive posture. Well, what was interesting about the challenge of Target, and the reason that they hired us, was to come up with a new paradigm whereby they could move their stores into cities where there wasn't enough land to actually to actually use the same suburban formula of a big box surrounded by a parking lot. So they had to find a way of consolidating things at the same, and the reason they were interested in doing this was because their market, with, as many of you have read, people are moving into cities now from rural areas. In order to keep their profits up, they need to follow the population, but they didn't really have a business model or an architectural model to figure out how to do that. And they were finding a lot of opposition to communities who were worried about them taking away jobs. So we tried to create something more problematic or paradoxical for these communities by setting up a quid pro quo, where we would say, well, we're coming into your city, but rather than you're just seeing that we're going to be somehow suspecting that Target's going to be taking away jobs, we're also going to provide you with something else which you lack, which is namely public space. So every time you get a Target, you get actually public space that you direly need. So suddenly people are beginning to weigh the difference, like, oh, well, maybe this is worth it because I don't have a place to take my kid. The Trojan horse aspect. So we did a kind of focus group study or subculture study by actually looking at Target's own website, under which there's a subheading called Target Communities. And we developed a series of different kinds of subcultures just within Target, called Target Green, Target Town, and Target Play. And we located each of these different versions of Target in areas of the country that were particularly tailored to where each of those qualities was actually in deficit. So that in Phoenix, we had Target Green. In Tracy, California, which is at the very outer ring of suburbs, we placed Target Town. And in Brooklyn, which has an extraordinarily low amount of open space per capita, we put Target Play. This is an area, I'm just going to run through these rather quickly. They're fairly self-explanatory, but we were obviously very attentive to the kind of Google view of this, and very interested in the way in which one could actually use Google Earth versus the bird's eye view versus the street level view as different ways in which the project could begin to appear different as you actually move down in point of view. So that this two-dimensional image, which was something the marketing department was very interested in, and they had experimented with a lot at nearby airports where planes were landing, was something that began to become three-dimensionalized as you move down from that privileged point of view. This is Target Town outside of Tracy, where we used a kind of spiral. I think you saw that we had some diagrams showing that we used different carving techniques or different kind of techniques to actually model the surface. And we basically hid, most of the parking was either on the roof of the box, and then additional, since we needed more parking than that, was basically snuck underneath these public spaces, where you would slide into the cuts in the oblique surface in order to find your way into a lot of the satellite uses and particular areas of the Target box itself. This is in Phoenix here. Those are all solar panels. We had aviaries. There's even there's camping. Target Green was not so much about greenwashing. Well, actually, I should say it was exactly about greenwashing. It was actually to say this whole shit about, just saying, oh, this is very sustainable, this and sustainable that, is just a matter of, let's face it, trying to get something through approvals because you're trying to check off different boxes to get your LEED certification. And so we sort of half jokingly, but in a serious way, said greenwashing should be taken more seriously as a technique so that you're less interested in green as sustainability alone and tying in that, having that market segment so, instead of being so shaming about or politically correct about it, we're just simply interested in anything that's green. So we looked at everything from algae tanks to putting greens to camping, to things that actually were bona fide green in other ways. But the idea was basically to enlarge the catchment area of people who would be serviced by, or not serviced by, but attracted to come here. So the goal was not simply to service, as in the old model of infrastructure, it was actually to attract, as in the model of private development, to actually make this a kind of a destination. This is for a project, the second one, called Up the Block, which is right downtown, in downtown Los Angeles. This is a little bit, let's see if I can kind of get you all oriented. This is the 110 freeway, so north is kind of looking upward. This is a very large development with 2 towers, existing towers, one of which is an old Sheraton hotel, another is an office tower. And there's a kind of, well, I'd be complimenting it too much if I said it was a kind of Rockefeller Center style court, but it was a dismal kind of court that was roofed in glass, and then an extraordinarily large 1,000 square foot, 1,000 car, actually it was 1,500 car garage that was 8 stories high on top of a Macy's. And this is what it looks like. So let me show you. These are the 2 towers. Here's the Sheraton. Here's the garage. And the interesting thing about this was that they were planning a kind of mixed-use development. But they asked us not to work on this, which I was very happy not to do. They actually asked us to look at what could be done with the garage. Well, there was a parking requirement. This is the interesting part. There was a parking requirement, obviously for the project, but when the garage was entitled many, many years ago, cars were much bigger. The parking requirements had since been downsized so that the spaces that you needed to stripe inside of a garage were no longer as large. So when you restriped the garage and you recalculated how much of the garage the parking requirement took up, it turned out that 30,000 square feet of that garage were liberated to become something else because there was extra space. So there's actually excess capacity from the overbuilding of that infrastructure. And that's where the project actually took root. So we began to look at how we could basically hang things off of the side of the garage that looked out onto that Rockefeller Center-like space by stuffing stuff into the garage and taking advantage of actually the quality that the garage itself had as something that might be desirable to, say, creative office, to a private club and an art movie house that was on top, as well a restaurant, a bowling alley that had 18 lanes, and then basically to link everything with a series of escalators up the side, sort of a la the Pompidou Center. So these are all sort of demarcated here. These purple things are the punch outs of these offices where you could actually drive up the garage and park your car right off the side of where your office was, but you'd at the same time be linked to this escalator system. These were holes that were actually cut in the old wall of the garage to expose some of the cars and so on. So it was a kind of flipping up of a plan into elevation of sorts. We did a very large sort of study model of what this might look like. This is sort of from the side with these really oversized kind of awnings on the bottom. And then this is kind of what it began to look like. And this is kind of slated to be kind of a later phase development. They're just finishing up the first phase of the project now. You can see the escalators going up. These are the offices kind of sticking out. They come out 15 feet and they go in the 18 feet of the parking stalls that used to be there, but are now, so these offices sit sort of halfway in and halfway out of the garage. And then the overall effect, we kind of used a kind of marquetry pattern, like wood marquetry, in order to create a facade that would seem to kind of shimmer and have a kind of three-dimensional illusory effect when viewed, that really sort of fragmented and sort of in some senses kind of denied its work back and forth with its flatness, where you really weren't sure where the building was. You saw patches of people working, patches of cars, patches of marquetry as a kind of collage of activities going on at the same time. And this is at night, where we actually were using that, what's called a kind of isotopic glass, where the offices then were able to have their glass made opaque and to be rear projected with artwork. In this case, we're showing some Doug Aiken. Third project is for a very large one in Ronkonkoma. Some of you may know it. I think I showed a little bit of this project you'll recognize at the lottery, maybe at the lottery, or maybe it was just an intro to my group. It's a project that, I don't know, we got very much into parking, which seems to be this kind of meeting ground between the building of infrastructure and the opportunities for new development. So in this particular case, Ronkonkoma is located in eastern Long Island, very close to where there are a lot of the Hamptons are. So this particular site sits along the Long Island Railway, just south of the 495 Expressway, and immediately adjacent to the MacArthur Long Island Airport, where a lot of people will fly out of New York to beat the traffic to go down to Miami for the winter trips, or to fly in the summer to actually visit friends who are summering or have houses rented in eastern Long Island. And the site, which is right here, is an absolutely enormous 3,500 car surface parking lot in the middle of literally nowhere. It would be a stretch to call it a town. So this is that parking lot. This is the railway. This is the beginning of the landing strip for MacArthur Airport. So we looked at, in this particular case, sort of like with the Up the Block project, we looked for something which was hidden in plain sight, which, as in the case of the block, it was the change in the zoning code that allowed us to carve out some space that used to be required for parking. In this particular case, it was time-based, where we found that even though the lot was full, all 3,500 spaces were full every weekday, they were near half empty on the weekends and near entirely empty in the evenings. And so we began to look at how there might be a way of actually building in a series of other attractions that would incorporate the parking, but add additional things to it that really became kind of like a regional destination. And so we used the idea of the parking itself to leverage a series of connections to other activities that you could get to either on your way to the train, on your way home from the train, or just coming there when you weren't using the train, because the flow of passengers and commuters between Long Island and Manhattan has now fundamentally shifted, so that these people who live out here are no longer assumed to be commuting in Manhattan in the morning. Many of them are actually commuting just down the line one stop, or coming up the line another stop, or choosing to work at home. And so the role that these stations play is fundamentally shifting from that of the bedroom communities that used to characterize them. So our starting point was kind of to look at this as a counterpoint, as kind of the alt version of Manhattan, by providing to the emptiness, the ruralness of Long Island, what Central Park does to Manhattan's density, so that this would be the one island of density amidst an island, within an island of rural fabric, of agraria, just as the way that that Central Park is a contrast to that. And then we quite literally went through an exercise of figuring out how Manhattan's block system would overlay on our site. Astonishingly, this site is so large, there are 12 blocks of Manhattan that would actually fit on it. And then we started looking at the fact that we could inescapably not make the association between the fact that Manhattan came with an idea. There was a moment at which the romance of the airplane and the fact that MacArthur Airport was associated with our site kind of came together with Manhattan at one point through the element of the Empire State Building. We began to kind of play around a little bit with the idea that maybe that might be what Manhattan at rest would look like. And so we started to think about whether or not that could be something that was to the 495 what the Long Island duckling had, and a number of other roadside attractions that had developed there historically had characterized it as being your trip out from Manhattan. So we took the figure, the primitive of the volume of the Empire State Building, which is not even as long as the site is, and we used it to kind of carve away at a generic parking deck, imagining that the whole site was filled with parking. We did it once, then we flipped it around and we did it again. And we began to carve a series of figures that you see here into the block, one of which was pushed in from the side, which has subsequently become the train station, and another one of which was pushed in from the top, which became a kind of winterized athletic facility, not unlike the Carrier Dome. And then we also similarly looked at things that we knew to be Manhattan-like Chelsea Piers, Times Square, Lincoln Center, and so on, Chelsea Market, and figured out just wanted to think a little bit about how many of those could fit on the site. If you were to create something that economists call a family entertainment center, a family activity center, which is a place basically where people who are looking to do something with their kids when it's raining, when they're not at the beach, can go do. So this project became programmed inserted with a bunch of those other kinds of functions in the gaps where the parking was not, with the parking serving as the poché in between these figured spaces. And then through it, we skewered a series of itineraries or trip chains for different types of people as they might have reasons to cross through the project. So versus Manhattan, where everything would be very typically layered in a very regimented way, we began to look at whether or not we could create a different kind of wafer sandwich by having the parking alternate with the different functions. So parking alternates with tenant program, and you could actually, once you parked, you could just go up or down to your office. You didn't necessarily have to walk across some large expense to get there. And then we wove into it, you'll see in a second, the series of parking ramps, which we called New Park Avenue, right down the center, a center spline, which basically wove the different layers together vertically. But it was an interweaving of both parking ramps and pedestrians on escalators. So it would be imagining that you were to allow a car into a mall, into an old indoor mall. Of course, we were anticipating at the same time that the car is on its way to becoming without emissions, which would enable the intertwining of those to ultimately become even more liberated. So the sections started looking a little something like this. This was the point of arrival in the train station shelter on the north side. This was the spline that I mentioned before, with the train station platform in yellow, and then the ways of accessing things by car in blue. And this is some view of that space, which has kind of intertwining of linkages, pedestrian linkages between offices on different floors, interweaving with car linkages on ramps and bridges between those alternating floors. Something reminiscent of the Italian job, putting a pig in a parlor. And that's really the kind of device, the kind of Trojan horse aspect is to say, yeah, a building can be infrastructure and infrastructure can be a building. In other words, deliberately trying to confuse categories of things in order to get that a kind of astonishing effect. And this is a little view of what that would look like inside of the, this is special for you, we recolored it orange. No, I'm just kidding. In fact, we had a different motive, you'll see in a second. It wasn't an ode to Syracuse. It was actually the fact that we were interested in the fact that, as many of you know, that all the buildings that are within a certain proximity of the airport are checkered white and yellow, or white and orange. And so we kind of did a montage of these different things together. We wanted to create a soft Empire State Building because of the athletic purpose. We wanted it to be near the airport, so we had to be attentive to it was near the airport, so it needed to be attentive to landing planes and so on, which produces these kinds of scenes around it. And then, this is just a kind of postscript to it. We published a newspaper. It's actually an online newspaper which is a website for the project, which I've become very interested in doing, which really talks about the future of the project. It's a way of presenting the project as if it were written at the time it would be built, 20 years in the future, so that people could begin to imagine from the point of view of different stakeholders and those different audiences or subcultures that I talked about, how they would engage, how these different types of people would actually engage the project in entirely different ways. So on the website, which is www.ronkonkoma.parksandrides.com, you can click on each of these and they open up into larger articles. There's food criticism of a restaurant, but all of them actually things like that, but even the ones that are reviews of movies and so forth, always have embedded within them elements of the story of the design itself through a particular point of view, and we actually asked a variety of different people to write them as well, so that we could allow for a kind of the entry of different readers, those who would receive the design in a way that wasn't overly scripted by the way that we had conceived it. Okay, last project. This one was through a similar observation. This is again about the insufficiency of infrastructure. This is the project that Lindsay mentioned called Hypo Park. This is a prototype that we're going to be implementing hopefully in the next year or so through an association between my old firm and Gensler. The observation was made, it was again something that I had noticed, that parks, the appearance of parks as we currently think about them in Los Angeles are out of sync with the nature of how people view contemporary recreation today and public life. I love this slide because all of the things that you actually want to do are not allowed in the park, and there are only a few things that you do. You can walk there, you can sit on a bench, you can walk your dog, and you can sell drugs, which aren't allowed, but that goes on anyway. But anyway, somehow or other, all the limitations are listed in this long manuscript, somehow suggest that something is wrong or out of date about the paradigm. So we started to wonder whether or not maybe the problem was that, while that paradigm worked for a long time based upon the idea of nature as spectacle, that it was actually places like Venice Beach and Muscle Beach in particular, where it was actually exercise a spectacle. That was the spectacle of seeing other people doing things that actually had truly supplanted that. And that had actually become a kind of form of, it was a kind of form of performance to popular culture. Even the swing sets on the Santa Monica Beach are used, as I've explained to my students, for all kinds of other functions which are more meaningful in very unexpected ways that were certainly not part of their design in traditional ways. And I go back to this because I wanted to just allude to the idea that this is more resemblant of the current paradigm of where we're at the moment. However offensive it may be to us, it's actually indicative that there has been a paradigm shift in terms of what people consider to be a park, or where it is that they'll go in order to, let's say, have fun, meaning that kids would rather go here and have fun than they would into that park that I showed you, MacArthur Park. So for us, that became kind of an interesting opportunity to explore the idea about whether or not, from a design standpoint, there was another false dichotomy that was being set up, which was between the idea of open space and infill. And why there couldn't be something that somehow blurred the lines between something that was open and something that was solid and void. So we sought to create a kind of idea of something that Andrew Zago has referred to as a kind of empty density, something that appears to be perceived of as infill, and yet it's not quite that way. So the project Hypo Park is located in, at least the prototype that we developed is located in Koreatown. I'll tell you a little bit about it. We did some comparisons, and this is the way that we worked on it. This is what you can do in MacArthur Park, and this is what you can do in Hypo Park. But moreover, so this is another way of kind of outlining, this is kind of the anatomy of it, I'll go through. But this is actually, dry as it may seem, this is very important because this really outlines the strategy. Hypo Park actually has an FAR, first time that a park could ever be said to have a floor area ratio, because it actually has more than one story. The land itself is not assumed to be the park. It's actually just half of the park itself. As a consequence of that, you have you have a lower land utilization cost. You burn more calories by 3 times because of the activities that are sponsored. The maintenance costs are greatly lowered because you have no plants in it. And you actually open yourself up to a variety of other more interested parties than just relying upon the Department of Parks and Recreation to actually do it. And importantly, that seems very dry, but that single page, just for everybody, students, that'll be hard to appreciate that. That single page was like the eureka moment when we show it to people. Like it becomes beautiful to people when they see that page, and whereas when they see the images, they're not sure yet, but then they see that and they go, oh my God, this is fantastic. You know, we can do all of these things. It helps us do stuff. So a lot of times, you know, people are seeing things from a variety of different perspectives, and we may have had our own agenda in terms of the kinds of things that you're looking at with respect to qualities of transparency, mixing together ideas of art, graffiti, landscape, super graphics, nature, and so on and so forth. But in order to make it beautiful to other people, that has to have a kind of embedded intelligence of an infrastructural planner or an infrastructural thinker. So we were interested, you know, I'm a student of history. We went back to a very early study, very obscure study of a project that little study that Frank Gehry did just prior to his building the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium down in San Pedro that the class visited, where he was looking at this idea of enclosing nature in making things that were considered just to be fences, used infrastructural elements actually volumetric. And then we created a kind of morphology of elements that kind of came together. The clouds that you saw maybe in the renderings were used for both campsites, putting greens, and parkour. For birthday parties, they could be rented out. The sets of these bridge courts and ramps were used by seniors at a 1 to 12 slope, ADA. They all had kind of differing logics. These kind of are more recollective of the bouncy house. So I know it's very funny and it sounds very flip, but it actually, I'm interested in interrogating a lot of these kinds of things and seeing whether you can kind of make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, because somehow their popularity speaks to a kind of untapped potential. And then we were also interested in explorations from Liechtenstein and how nature could be portrayed in a very flat way. Very different than Georgina is doing, perhaps, but maybe I'm thinking related right now as I'm talking about it. And so we did a little study that, and also Ed Richet and how the overlay of just graphics on photographs of landscapes that don't necessarily have anything to do with one another, and yet you're conflating 2 places at once. So we began to we just did experiments about how we could transpose the typical nature scene of MacArthur Park and somehow reproduce that graphically in some other kind of way through a kind of almost like 3-dimensional spatialized collage. And this is a little bit what it looks like on the inside with the bridges crossing over. Some things that divide, that look at, again, I'm talking to you again about thinking about these audiences and about service and catchment, the difference between the two, about thinking about how what things that, you know, may attract children, what may attract adults versus seniors or teens, without necessarily turning those into caricatures, just as different elements of it. This is another view. And then also just the timetable, as we did in a couple of the other projects that I showed you, just thinking about how the density and intensity of uses would differ over time, but moreover, how you would have a bona fide alternative, which was very attractive to the investors we're talking to, about how, unlike MacArthur Park and many other parks of the old model, a park becoming a place that becomes very sinister at night, but friendly during the day, how actually this park is able to be closed off as a set of capsules or organs that enable other pieces to be open in limiting extents at other limited hours. It also incorporated 2 concessionaires. This is a kind of a small juice. We're just showing a kind of juice bar. In this location, there's a 2 handball courts above, and there's a newsstand on the other side. There's also a bike rental shop, and these are very important for a couple of reasons. One is that idea of trying to break down the distinction between enclosed space and open enclosed space and covered enclosed space, so that the idea of what a building is, mixed use, is not just about commercial versus retail versus housing. It's literally folding into the idea of mixed use, the idea of open space as well, that a park can be that. Of course, these paradigms are already happening, as we know, in places like in Asia and many other places, but they're completely covered up as kind of indoor theme parks. But the idea was whether you could take something that you would very readily dismiss as being just crass commercialism and actually try to make it critical in a serious way. So in closing, I just wanted to say that this is, many of you may recognize a picture of Wrigley Field. This is always a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of a signal image for me, because it speaks to the power of infrastructure reconceived in a more entrepreneurial way, to think about its ability to catalyze that in the city that lies around it, so that the spectacle of what constitutes the place that we know as in this case Wrigley Field is made up not just of the initial infrastructural investment, but actually catches fire and begins to excite the imagination and entrepreneurial imagination, more particularly of those who actually live next to it, so that it actually achieves the ambition of the systems model, of the extensive systems model of infrastructure, but instead of providing it all at once, is something that actually is underlined by a strategy of growth and a certain degree of kind of shaped future, future that is not overly dictated, but at the same time highly suggestive of what its implications and opportunities are and lie embedded in those first moves. Thank you. Happy to take questions if anybody has them.
Thanks, Roger, for the talk. The CoStar Group recently released a report saying that 40% of all U.S. retail is essentially doomed. Saying that 40% of all U.S. retail centers, such as malls, are going to close down, and that's particularly due to a number of economic and behavioral reasons, many of which you pointed out: population shifting, the whole big box model being based off of suburban sprawl. But also it's due to these technological and social innovations, disruptions that have happened, such as Amazon. And so I guess the question is, do you have any speculations on what other disruptions, such as self-driverless cars, might affect these urban forms? Is the model to just always produce these mixed-use centers so we can repopulate the spaces?
Well, I think that it's not so much, I wouldn't lump all the mixed-use centers together in the sense that it's all about what the composition of them is. It's really a question of what's being mixed and how you mix it, because the elements that are in the mix are unstable, but the strategies about how to mix them are not, meaning there'll always be something supplanting. There's always a need to populate cities or be together for differing reasons. But one thing, there'll always be another paradigm that will come along. I mean, at the moment, the thing that interests me, but just in the last, couple of months since it came out about Pokemon Go, is fascinating to me because I think that what is being termed, I've learned, the gamification of urban space is fascinating because it's taking places, it's only in a very crude way right now. If people walking around like this, just looking at their screen, does not constitute the public inhabitation of space except in a very technical way. But the opportunities, I think, as a signal moment for a change in what the power of digital community might provide, or gaming, in terms of the reactivation of the city is a fun, I see instinctively, I think is a fundamental shift in how we're going to be thinking about cities, because there are spaces now, as I mentioned before, that have not worked and haven't been working for a very long time because they were based upon a civic model, which is analogous to what I refer to as network television. I personally am not a believer in the civic. I don't believe that exists in many large metropolitan cities anymore. I think the cities are comprised of, as I've outlined here, many subcultures, but I think gamification is an interesting and very powerful tool to begin to think about how the digital and physical realm of space the digital can actually be used as a means of activating that space if they're actually conceived of in concert, as opposed to being just a retrofit, something that happens to be happening in a space that already exists. So I think it will happen, and I think if we don't do it, I think there'll be opportunities which game designers will come up with to do it, and people will be going to those malls or other places that they find it. So I'm not sure what the future is, but I don't, yeah. Anybody else?
Thank you, Roger. Great lecture, really smart. I guess my question has to do with there's a great deal of infrastructural thinking and sometimes infrastructural tactics at play, so it's not just thinking. There are also formal tactics at play. There are different project to project. I wanted you to perhaps talk about how you work formally. And again, I think it's different. Talking about the Park project, very, very different in terms of formal strategy, but there are formal strategies there. So I guess I'm wondering how you approach a project formally within the infrastructural project.
Well, I think hopefully it was clear. There's certainly an interest in the project in kind of reviving in a new form or taking up the kind of interest of Venturi, but not necessarily. I mean, more with respect to an interest in pop culture and the flat, and the kind of the kind of rehydrating of it, but in a different material and graphic way through somewhat more complex graphic means and material means than I think Venturi was ever interested in. In other words, paint alone, I'm not interested in that, and I'm not interested kind of purely in the kind of appearances of shape, but rather in the conflation and confusion between the two-dimensional surface and how we read two-dimensional surfaces, and how they can be out of sync with the reading of a three-dimensional object. I mean, I think we have even though they are very different, I think there's some similarity. It's one of the reasons that I'm interested also in some of the work that Georgina is doing as well. I actually, for instance, feel that Photoshop is this grossly under-excavated software artistically. I think it has huge potential to be exploited much more. And I think maybe it's just a second generation thing where it had to be the next group to come along to say, wait a minute, you missed something. I sort of feel that way with Venturi as well. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I think that's in there, that's in the projects somehow. And I think that for me, because I talk about subcultures and so on, if you're trying to send a signal like a pheromone to a group to understand, it's like, yes, we're talking about, this is about kind of the merging of entertainment and planning, then I think the idea of working with pop culture has to be a part of that. I mean, it's not, I think this is also about the reader, not about the author only. So I see myself as somewhat of an editor of codes and putting those together and hoping that it's never too obvious what it is or too self-evident, so that people things still read as a rebus or a puzzle that intrigues people, but there's something about it at the same time that feels very accessible, and that they have to work a little bit harder to figure it out, but there's still something, but it's not overly cryptic at first. Sure. Yeah.
I was wondering how this extends to kind of larger discipline of architecture. Obviously, these are specific projects that either you have been directly sought out by a company, but do you imagine that there's another form of kind of dialogue between architects and maybe other industries or other organizations of mass culture that has yet to develop in terms of continuing this project? Or is it something that maybe is still kind of just based on a commission?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but whether this is the answer to your question or not, but I feel in many ways that, there's a woman that I really feel who's writing a lot about the discipline of design, named Penelope Dean at University of Illinois, Chicago. And she's talked about the sacrificing of territory by our discipline to the larger realm of others claiming to be designers. And I'm very consciously aware of that, and it worries me greatly. And I don't want that to be in my own personal case, but also for the sake of the profession, I don't want that to be a tragic story. And so I feel, to some extent, that it's kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them. In other words, there has to be an acknowledgement that the world of media has just overtaken architecture in a huge way. And that if architecture, that's why in many ways I felt that the Venturi thing had to be readdressed. Because I think he was the first one, if in a much more innocent era, to understand that that media was a big wave that was coming. And that now, of course, we have much more. We have digital technology and a lot of other things happening. But I think that it has to be engaged, and I don't mean it in terms of merely software. I mean it in terms of the actual design of experience itself. That I think the more that we're willing to explore and risk working at the boundaries of what is traditionally called architecture, and where it starts becoming difficult to say whether it's architecture or a media thing, I think its relevancy is more enhanced. I don't think that weakens architecture. I believe, or I wouldn't be doing it, that media, the contemporary media, is exerting a gravitational pull on architecture. And if you ignore it, you will just be left out. Because I see it happening everywhere, where people are not hiring architects first. They're hiring design strategists or media consultants. And then the architect is hired to do a thing, as part of that. But the strategic conception of stuff, very bad versions in many cases, but also very good versions, the smarter ones, I think is kind of where I see things going. And I find that stimulating or challenging to myself to begin to think about how, where that can go. I didn't show it tonight, but we did a project very recently for the Sunset Strip, and I didn't come up with the project. It came in through the city of West Hollywood to do a new digital signage installation, to rethink the image of the Sunset Strip with the advent of digital media technology. And the other three architects all did towers that had the sign just, posted on. But they were really nice, but the media component was stuck on, so it wasn't that, well, in some cases they were more like just a tall wall that had it on, in other cases not, but in effect, I felt that it was like architecture's last stand. It was saying, we're still going to make a tower and we're going to just stick this on. Whereas I felt that we had to come at it from the other standpoint. I felt that we had to come at it from the design of the graphic image of the advertising. Indeed, that was the thing that was paying everything. And then to, in a way, design architecture as like the armature for it. In other words, that the thing had to be like I've never seen, that is not an object. It's an image that they're trying to consult. Even if the image is not on one surface, even if the image is wrapped around several, it is in a sense the dominant, the kind of dominant experience, and that there's something, it had to approach something that was a little bit more hybridic than that. And I felt, and that was something that the city, of all people, just like government officials said, this is going to change. We see this going on. We can't just build signs on sticks. We can't just put signs on this, because people come there to see those, to see that that's the attraction, right? They think that the old streamlined modern buildings on the Strip and the stuff from the 50s are quaint, like historical artifacts, but they're coming for the media sensation. Yet there are many, many examples of really horrible versions, like LA Live, where it's just stuff, killing you with images. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I believe that actually something more immersive, that it's possible to create more immersive environments. And that's where I think we're needed to actually talk about space and form, that I'm not sure that, that media designers, a lot of them, quite understand that, whereas actually, but I think there are also some who are really beginning to do it, so. Yeah.
I was very interested in how your architecture is kind of very immersive with the public, but it seems to me like their architecture is already, the buildings that you're sort of designing are already in areas which people feel comfortable to go around. We were recently given a project to design an arts center in downtown Syracuse. I visited the site, it was pretty shady, and I was wondering that, if your sort of architecture was to be there, how would you make people feel more secure and like make them willing to come all the way there? Because walking there around that area itself, people would be like unwilling to go to the building.
Well, when I showed you a diagram about the Target project where I said wolf in sheep's clothing is defensive and the Trojan horse is projective. That's what I would go back to, is just say, if you start to approach a project from the standpoint of all the things that worry you, that you're gonna just respond simply to all of the so-called concerns, you'll end up backing yourself into a project, but you won't create desire in order to do it. I think desire for people to come there, and I think you have to. You cannot. I've never believed that you can underestimate or should ever underestimate the power of desire to overcome fear. And you can always address those other questions as modifications or adaptations to the idea that you saw it, but not as a way of entering into a project through I'll call it like a prophylactic method. Like I worried about that. I took care of this. Oh, everything's okay. But somehow it still doesn't make us want it or want to be there. Well, I'll be here tomorrow. So.
Can I add on that before you
Yeah.
sorry, tomorrow at, was there another question, Lindsay? Sorry.
I don't think so.
I apologize if it was. That's good. Tomorrow, 3 to 5 p.m. in here, there will be a little mini symposium on density. I think it's called Through Thick and Thin. Roger will be speaking, Michael Bettis will be speaking, and